Let's see now some physiological aspects of the lung. The amount of air that can be inspired in or out of the lung is a good indicator of lung functionality. Scientists came up with several terms and definitions for different amount of volumes. Maybe it's better to go through the image. Now, the tidal volume, this is the first one. Tidal volume is the amount of air or the volume of air inhaled and exhaled in a single breath under normal condition. Amount of air inhaled in and out in a single breath. Then we have the vital capacity, which is the maximum volume that can be exhaled after maximum inhalation. So if you hold your breath, if you not hold your breath, if you like take a deep breath, that would be your vital capacity. Another term is something called inspiratory reserve volume. This is the volume of air that can be inhaled beyond the tidal volume, which is this one. So this is like your again deep breath. Okay, but there is a difference between the deep breath and the inspiratory reserve volume and the vital capacity, which we will explain later in the lab. The expiratory reserve volume is the amount of air that you can forcibly exhale beyond the tidal volume. Forcibly exhale beyond the tidal volume. And then we have the residual volume. This is the volume of air remaining in your lungs even after forceful maximal expiration. So this is the amount of air that would remain in our lungs no matter what. We cannot take it out of our lungs. Now, all of these measurements, all of these different volumes of air can be measured through something called spirometer. Usually patients would have to breathe within this spirometer, and the spirometer is connected to a computer system that will determine these volumes. Let's see now other details, some other details regarding gas exchange and transportation. And before going into that, we need to understand that gases have exert pressure. They have like a force or pressure against the space they occupy. If there is a mix of gases, then each gas will exert different and the proportional percentage. It will exert different and the proportional pressure to its percentage of the total gas composition, and that is the partial pressure. So imagine, let's say that we have a balloon, and within this balloon there are three different gases, like 70% CO2, 20% oxygen, and let's say 10% nitrogen. So the pressure from the CO2 is the highest against this balloon comparing to the oxygen, because we have more of the CO2. And usually what will happen that the gas would move from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. So if we connected this balloon to another balloon, whereas here the percentage of CO2 is, let's say, 50%, then CO2 would move into this area. But if it was the oxygen was here 20%, then oxygen will not move. If the nitrogen is moving, if the nitrogen is 5% here, the nitrogen would move into this direction. So gases are going to diffuse from higher to lower partial, nitrogen would also diffuse into this direction, from higher to lower partial pressures. Now, to understand how is this applicable to our body, let's go to this image. For the oxygen, the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere air is the highest, right? Whereas it is in our body low. It's 104 in our body, and it's 160 in the outer air. So the oxygen will diffuse from the area of high concentration to the area of low concentration. And that is how we are getting the oxygen inside the alveolus. Here, within the alveolus, it is 104, in the blood capillary is 100. So again, oxygen will diffuse into the blood capillary. And it will remain 100 through the systemic circuit, all the way to the tissue. In the tissue, in the blood capillary is 100, in the cells is around or less than 40. So oxygen will diffuse toward the cells. Again, from area of high concentration to area of low concentration. Let's see now the CO2. CO2 within the cell is high, is more than 46 partial pressure. CO2 would diffuse into the blood capillaries because CO2 within the blood capillaries, within the blood, is less than 46. So CO2 would move from area of high pressure to the area of low pressure. And it will continue through the systemic circuit all the way to the alveolus. The partial pressure of the alveolus, of CO2 in the alveolus, is around 40 or 46. But in the outer air, it's 0.3. Inside the alveolus is 40. So this is an area of high, actually very high partial pressure of CO2. So CO2 will diffuse out toward the area of low pressure. This is how the partial pressures of these two gases are helping us to breathe. Again, just remember that the air would move from area of high pressure to area of low pressure. And again, this is how these gases are moving, and this is how we are breathing. Now, another concept of respiratory system is its ability to transport oxygen and CO2. And if you remember, we talked earlier that blood transport oxygen and CO2 throughout the body. And we said that the blood cells contains the hemoglobin that is responsible for binding 98% of the oxygen actually and transporting it through the body. So most of the oxygen is transported by binding to the hemoglobin and forming something called oxyhemoglobin. However, 2% of the oxygen is just directly dissolved into the plasma. However, as you can see here, this is 2% dissolved in the plasma, and 98% of oxygen is combined with hemoglobin. However, for CO2, it's a little bit different story. We have 10% of CO2 is dissolved into the plasma, 20% of CO2 is binding to hemoglobin, to the red blood cell, and the majority, 70% of CO2 would be converted into bicarbonate, and that bicarbonate would be diffused into the plasma. To convert into bicarbonate, CO2 has to go through has to enter the red blood cells. Over there is an enzyme that will convert the CO2 to bicarbonate, and then this bicarbonate will be sent out to the plasma and transported as diffused ion into the plasma, or dissolved ion within the plasma. So this is an animation about human respiratory system. Please watch it. And I will stop here. The rest of the slides are about the disorders of the respiratory system. They are pretty straightforward. I won't explain them because I'll be reading them word by word to save you some time. Please post your comments, videos, ideas, thoughts into the forum, and we will talk more in the lab.